The mountain is quiet tonight. Outside the city of Mecca, a single man climbs a steep, rocky path in the dark, alone, the way he has come alone many nights before. He carries a little food, a water skin, and something heavier than either of those, a question he cannot put down. Why does the world look like this? Why do people bow to statues carved from stone, statues that cannot see, cannot hear, cannot help anyone at all? Why are the poor forgotten, the orphan pushed aside, the weak crushed by the strong? He reaches a small cave near the top of the mountain, a cave called Hira, and he sits as he often does to think. This time, though, something is different. A presence fills the cave. Not a sound exactly, not a shadow exactly. Something he has never felt before in 40 years of life. Something that wraps around him like an embrace too tight to escape, pressing the breath from his chest. A voice speaks a single word. Iqra, read. He cannot read. No one has ever taught him to. He tells the presence so, and still it presses against him again, and again the word comes, read. And then more words follow, words unlike anything spoken in Arabia before, words that will, within one lifetime, change the spiritual map of the entire world. When it ends, the man bursts from the cave into the night, his heart pounding so hard he can feel it in his throat. He half runs, half stumbles down the mountain in the dark, not toward safety, but toward home, toward the one person on earth he trusts enough to tell. Can you imagine that walk down the mountain? Not knowing yet what has just happened to you, not knowing that you have just become the last prophet God would ever send to humanity. His name is Muhammad, and this single night on a mountain outside Mecca is the hinge on which his whole life turns. But to understand why this night mattered so much, we have to go back past this cave, past this mountain, back 40 years, to the day a baby was born into a city already trembling from something extraordinary. Before we meet Muhammad, we need to meet his world, because nothing in this story makes sense without it. Picture a stretch of desert in the western part of the Arabian Peninsula, in what is today Saudi Arabia. The sun here does not simply shine, it presses down on the sand like a weight. Trees are rare, water is rarer, and yet, in the middle of this harsh land, one city had become impossible to ignore: Mecca. Mecca survived, and even thrived for one reason above all others: a small, cube-shaped stone building standing at its center, called the Kaaba. The word Kaaba simply means cube, and that is exactly its shape. According to the tradition passed down for generations, the Kaaba was first built by the prophet Abraham and his son Ishmael, on God's command, as a house dedicated to the worship of one God alone. For centuries, caravans of traders and pilgrims traveled across the desert, specifically to visit it. But by the time our story begins, something had gone wrong. The people of Arabia had drifted far from the original purpose of that sacred building. Instead of one God, the Kaaba had filled up with idols, statues of wood and stone, said to number in the hundreds, each one representing a different god that different tribes worshipped. Historians call this period in Arabia Jahiliyah, often translated as the Age of Ignorance. Not because the Arabs of this time were unintelligent. They were skilled poets, sharp traders, and fierce survivors of one of the harshest climates on earth, but because, in matters of right and wrong, much of their world had lost its way. Tribal loyalty mattered more than justice. If your tribe member did something wrong, you defended them anyway, even if they were guilty. Blood feuds between tribes could stretch on for generations, one revenge killing answered by another, and another, with no end in sight. Wealthy merchants lent money at crushing rates, knowing the poor could never pay it back. Orphans and widows, with no fathers or husbands to protect their interests, were frequently cheated out of what little they had, and in some of the harshest tribal customs of the time, baby girls were sometimes abandoned simply for being girls. This was the world Muhammad would be born into, and, though no one in Mecca had any way of knowing it yet, it was a world about to be offered a way out. The most powerful tribe controlling Mecca and its sacred Kaaba was the Quraysh. They were not kings exactly. Arabia at this time had no single ruler, no king of all the tribes, but the Quraysh held something arguably more valuable than a crown: control of the Kaaba itself, and with it, control of the lucrative trade and pilgrimage routes that passed through Mecca every year. To be Quraysh was to belong to the most respected, most connected family network in the entire region. Mecca sat along one of the great trade roads of the ancient world, the route connecting the spice and incense markets of Yemen in the south to the great empires of the Byzantines and Persians in the north. Caravans loaded with silk, spices, leather, and incense moved through constantly, which is part of why Mecca, despite sitting in the middle of a desert with no river and very little farmland, became one of the most important cities in Arabia. Into this city, proud, wealthy, deeply tribal, and spiritually adrift, a baby was about to be born. No one watching that night could have guessed what this child would one day become. A few months before our story's central figure was even born, Mecca came closer to disaster than it ever had before. Far to the south, in what is now Yemen, a powerful governor named Abraha ruled on behalf of the kingdom of Aksum in East Africa. Abraha had built an enormous, magnificent church in his own capital city, and he wanted it to become the new center of pilgrimage for all of Arabia, replacing Mecca and its humble stone Kaaba entirely. But the plan failed. Pilgrims kept traveling to Mecca instead, drawn by the Kaaba's deep, ancient sacredness, regardless of how grand Abraha's new church was. Furious at this failure, Abraha decided on a far more direct solution. If people would not stop visiting the Kaaba on their own, he would simply destroy it. He assembled a massive army, and at its center, something Arabia had never seen marching toward it before. War elephants, brought all the way from India, enormous and seemingly unstoppable. Imagine watching that army approach from a distance, the largest animals you have ever seen, moving in formation, with soldiers riding on their backs. Word reached Mecca of the army's approach, and the people of the city, having no way to fight such a force, fled to the surrounding hills, leaving the Kaaba to whatever fate awaited it. But the army never reached it. According to the accounts passed down through generations, and referenced directly in the Quran, in a chapter called Al-Fil, the elephant, the lead elephant simply refused to move forward toward the city, no matter how hard its handlers pushed or struck it. And then, the tradition holds, flocks of birds appeared in the sky above the army, each one dropping small stones down onto the soldiers below. Whatever truly happened on that battlefield, the result was undeniable. Abraha's vast army was thrown into chaos and retreat, and the Kaaba remained standing. This event happened so close to the date of our story's central birth that the entire year became known across Arabia as the Year of the Elephant, and it is how historians today still date the year of his birth, 570 CE. That same year, in that same city that had just narrowly escaped destruction, a woman named Amina gave birth to a son. His father, a young merchant named Abdullah, had died on a trading journey months earlier, meaning the boy would never meet his own father, not even once. His grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, one of the most respected leaders among the Quraysh, rushed to see his new grandson, carried him to the Kaaba in his arms, and gave thanks to God. He named the baby Muhammad, a name that was unusual in Arabia at the time, meaning the highly praised one. No one in that room could have known just how fitting that name would one day become. Here is something worth pausing on before we go any further. Have you ever felt like the new kid, the different one, the person other people aren't sure how to treat? Now imagine starting your entire life that way, with no father at all, in a society where fathers meant protection, status, and security. That was Muhammad's beginning. Soon after his birth, following a custom common among noble families of Mecca, baby Muhammad was sent away from the city to be raised for a time by a wet nurse in the desert. This was not abandonment. It was considered a gift to a child. Mecca's climate could be harsh and disease-prone for infants, while the open desert air was thought to build strength, and the pure, unmixed Arabic spoken by desert tribes was considered the most beautiful in the land. Wealthy families wanted their children to grow up speaking it. But there was a problem. Most nursing mothers selecting babies that year hoped for children from wealthy households who could reward them generously, and Muhammad's father was dead, his family no longer able to offer much in return. One by one, the women passed him by. The last woman left without a baby was named Halima bint Abi Duaib. She had arrived late, riding a weak, slow animal, and had found every other healthy infant already claimed. Returning home empty-handed felt like a failure she could not bear. Her husband suggested they take the orphan boy after all. "Perhaps," he said, "God will bless us through him." They had no idea how right he would be. According to the accounts passed down by Halima's own family, life changed for them almost immediately after Muhammad came into their home. Their thin, struggling animals grew strong and healthy. Halima's own milk, which had been scarce, began to flow abundantly enough to nurse both her own baby and Muhammad together. In a region suffering from famine that year, their household alone seemed to want for nothing. Muhammad stayed with Halima's family in the desert for several years, far longer than the usual arrangement, because both families had come to love the bond between them. According to the Sirah, the earliest written biographies of his life, it was during this time that something remarkable was said to have happened, that angels visited the young boy and purified his heart, a sign, though no one around him understood it yet, that he had been chosen for something far beyond ordinary life. Eventually, Muhammad returned to his mother Amina in Mecca, but their time together would be painfully short. When Muhammad was 6 years old, Amina took him on a journey to the city of Yathrib, the city we know today as Medina, to visit relatives and to visit the grave of the husband she had lost before their son was even born. It was, in its own way, a journey of grief and remembrance. On the return trip to Mecca, Amina fell ill. She did not recover. She died on the road in a small village called Al-Abwa and was buried there far from home. Muhammad was 6 years old. He had never known his father. Now he had lost his mother too, twice orphaned before he had even reached the age most of us start the 3rd grade. Can you imagine carrying that kind of loss at 6 years old? And yet, this would not be the last time loss would shape this boy's life. It would, in fact, become one of the deepest threads running through his entire story. After his mother's death, young Muhammad was taken in by his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, the same man who had carried him to the Kaaba as a newborn and given him his name. Abdul Muttalib was by this point an elderly man, but he doted on his grandson with open affection. There is a well-known story from this time. Abdul Muttalib had a special spot near the Kaaba, a kind of raised seating area reserved only for him, where even his own grown sons were not permitted to sit. One day, young Muhammad climbed up and sat there anyway. When others tried to pull the boy away, Abdul Muttalib stopped them. "Let him be," he said. "This is his place too." It was a small moment, but it tells us something. This was a child, surrounded by genuine love, even as an orphan. But that protection would not last either. When Muhammad was 8 years old, his grandfather died. For the 3rd time in his short life, the boy lost someone who had cared for him. This time his uncle, Abu Talib, took him in. Abu Talib was not among the wealthiest of the Quraysh, but he raised Muhammad as his own, and the two would remain close for decades. Abu Talib would go on to become one of the most important protectors of Muhammad's entire adult life, a debt of loyalty that began in this single act of taking in a grieving, orphaned boy. In Mecca society, an orphan without a wealthy family had very little social standing and few opportunities, and yet this particular orphan, fatherless, motherless, raised by relatives out of love rather than obligation, would one day be trusted by the very people who once might have overlooked him with something more valuable than gold, their honesty, their secrets, their disputes. That trust did not appear out of nowhere. It was built slowly over the years that followed, starting with the most humble work imaginable. Growing up in his uncle's household, Muhammad did not live a life of comfort. He worked. One of his first jobs was tending sheep and goats for Meccan herders out in the valleys beyond the city. Long, hot, lonely hours, watching over animals that could wander off or fall prey to danger at any moment. It was not glamorous work, but it taught him patience, responsibility, and the kind of quiet endurance that comes from being alone with your thoughts for hours at a time under an open sky. When he was around 12 years old, Muhammad joined his uncle Abu Talib on a long trading journey north to Syria, hundreds of miles by camel caravan, through desert and ancient trade towns. According to tradition, along the way, a Christian monk named Bahira, who lived along the caravan route, took notice of the boy and is said to have recognized signs in him suggesting an extraordinary future, though Abu Talib, cautious for his nephew's safety, did not linger to learn more, and the caravan moved on. As Muhammad grew into a young man, his reputation in Mecca grew along with him, but not for wealth and not for power. It grew for something far rarer in a city built on trade and bargaining: his honesty. People in Mecca began to call him by two names that were not his birth name at all, but titles he earned through years of behavior: Al-Amin, the trustworthy, and As-Sadiq, the truthful. Merchants left him in charge of goods and money without a second thought. Neighbors asked him to hold their valuables for safekeeping. In a city where clever bargaining and exaggeration were a normal part of doing business, Muhammad had become known as the one man whose word never needed to be checked twice. This reputation eventually reached the ears of one of the most successful and respected business figures in all of Mecca, and she was about to change the entire direction of his life. Her name was Khadija bint Khuwailid, and she was unlike most women of her time and place. Widowed, independently wealthy, and highly respected, Khadija ran her own successful trading business, sending caravans north to Syria, much like the one young Muhammad had once traveled with his uncle. She did not need a husband to manage her affairs. She managed them herself, and managed them well. Having heard of Muhammad's honesty, Khadija hired him to lead one of her trading caravans to Syria, offering him a generous share of the profits. He accepted and traveled with one of her trusted servants, a man named Masara, who watched closely how Muhammad conducted business along the way, fair, careful, and scrupulously honest in every transaction. When the caravan returned to Mecca, it had earned more profit than Khadija's caravans typically brought in, and Maysara had more to report than just numbers. He told Khadija of the young man's character, his patience, his integrity, the unusual calm and decency with which he carried himself. Khadija, by this point around 40 years old and twice widowed, sent a trusted friend to quietly ask Muhammad, who was around 25, whether he might consider marriage to her. Think about how unusual this was for the time. Khadija was the one who initiated the proposal. She was older, wealthier, and more established than he was, and Muhammad said yes, not to a fortune, but to a partnership with a woman he had come to deeply respect. They married, and by every account passed down through history, theirs became a marriage built on genuine partnership and devotion. Khadija would bear him several children, support him through hardships most people could never imagine enduring, and become, as we will see later in this story, the very first person to believe him when his entire world turned upside down. For 25 years, until her death, Muhammad would take no other wife. Of all the people in his long life, few would shape him as deeply as she did. Years passed. Muhammad, now a respected married man in his mid-30s, was known throughout Mecca not for wealth or political power, but for fairness, the kind of fairness people trust enough to ask for help settling their disputes. One such dispute nearly tore the city apart. The Kaaba had suffered damage over time, worn by age, and according to tradition, partly damaged by flooding, and the leading families of Mecca decided it needed to be rebuilt. The work itself went smoothly enough, but when it came time to return the Kaaba's most sacred object, a dark stone, believed to have been set in place since the days of Abraham and known today as the Black Stone, to its position in the wall, a furious argument broke out. Every major family wanted the honor of being the one to place it. Tensions rose so high that some accounts describe weapons being readied, the city teetering on the edge of violence over a single stone. Finally, someone suggested a solution. Let the next man to walk into the courtyard decide. Whoever that man turned out to be, his judgment would settle it. That man was Muhammad. He listened carefully to the dispute, then offered a solution that satisfied every family at once. He called for a large cloth to be laid on the ground, placed the black stone in its center, and asked the leader of each feuding family to take hold of one edge of the cloth. Together, all of them lifted it at the same time, carrying the stone to its resting place as equals. Then, with his own hands, Muhammad lifted the stone from the cloth and set it firmly into the wall. No single family had been given the honor over the others. No blood had been spilled. A potential war had been settled not with weapons, but with patience and fairness. Exactly the reputation Muhammad had spent his whole life building. He was around 35 years old. He had no idea that within 5 years his entire understanding of his own life and the world's understanding of him was about to change forever. On a quiet night, in a small cave on a mountain just outside the city, That is where we will pick up next, back at the mountain we began with, the night everything changed. We left Muhammad at 35, a married man known across Mecca for his fairness. Now let's go further, into the years that followed, the years that built toward that night on the mountain we opened this story with. By the time he reached his late 30s, something had begun changing in Muhammad. He started spending long stretches of time alone, away from the noise and business of the city, retreating to a small cave called Hira on a mountain just outside Mecca's edge. He would bring food, sit for days at a time, and think about the idols filling the Kaaba that could neither see nor hear, about the injustice toward the poor and the orphaned that surrounded him every day, and read about questions no one around him seemed to be asking. This was not unusual behavior exactly. Some people of that time sought solitude for reflection, but for Muhammad, it became something he returned to again and again, year after year, as though searching for an answer that hadn't arrived yet. Then in the year 610 CE, when Muhammad was about 40 years old, during the month the Arabs called Ramadan, a month that would soon take on a meaning far beyond anything it had held before, the answer came. You are sitting in the cool dark of a small cave, the kind barely tall enough to stand in. Outside, the desert night is silent except for wind moving across rock. You have sat in this exact spot many times before, alone with your thoughts. But tonight, the air itself feels different, heavier, as though something enormous has entered a very small space. And then a presence is upon you, pressing against you so tightly you cannot breathe, and a voice commands a single word, Qra'd. You cannot read. No one has ever taught you the letters. You say so, and still the pressure returns, and the word comes again. And then, finally, words beyond a single command begin to pour out. Verses unlike any poetry or speech you have ever heard in your life, carrying a kind of weight and rhythm that feels older than the mountain you're sitting on. These first words, later recorded as the opening verses of a chapter of the Quran called Al-Alaq, spoke of a creator who made human beings, who taught by the pen, who gave knowledge to those who knew nothing. The Quran itself, as you'll hear that word many times from here on, means the recitation. It is what Muslims believe to be the literal word of God, delivered to Muhammad across the next 23 years of his life, piece by piece, and eventually gathered into a single book. But on this particular night, Muhammad did not yet understand any of that. All he knew was terror. He fled the cave and ran, stumbling down the mountain in the dark, his heart pounding so violently he could feel it in his chest, convinced something was deeply wrong with him. He ran the whole way back to Mecca, back to the one person he trusted with everything, his wife, Khadijah. He burst into their home shaking and said the words history has preserved exactly, "Cover me, cover me." Khadijah wrapped him in a cloak and held him until the trembling slowly passed. When he was finally able to speak, he told her everything, the presence, the pressure, the words he could not have invented even if he'd tried, since he had never been taught to read or write at all. And here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Khadijah did not panic. She did not doubt him. Without hesitation, she told him she believed this had come from God, and that he was no madman, because she knew, better than anyone alive, the kind of man he had spent his entire adult life being, honest, fair, patient, kind to the weak. "You have always honored the bonds of kinship," she told him. "You speak the truth. You bear people's burdens. You help the needy." A man with that character, she reasoned, was not someone God would abandon to confusion. Still wanting more certainty, Khadijah took Muhammad to see her elderly cousin, a man named Waraka ibn Nawfal, a Christian scholar in Mecca who had studied the older scriptures closely and understood something most people in the city did not. When Muhammad described what had happened to him in the cave, Waraka's reaction was immediate and striking. "This," he said, "is the same angel that came to Moses. You are the prophet of this people." Then Waraka added something far heavier, a warning that would prove painfully true. "You will be called a liar. You will be hurt. You will be driven out, and you will be fought against." Muhammad, stunned, asked, "My own people would expel me." "Yes," Waraka answered. "No man has ever brought what you are bringing without facing opposition from his own people, and if I live to see that day, I will support you." Think about that moment. Muhammad had spent 40 years building a flawless reputation in Mecca, trusted by every family, liked by nearly everyone, with no enemies at all. And in a single night, without doing anything except telling the truth about what happened to him in a cave, he had just been told his entire world was about to turn against him. He did not yet know how right that warning would turn out to be. For now, only a handful of people knew what had happened on that mountain at all. The rest of Mecca had no idea that the most trusted man in their city had just become something the world had never quite seen before, the final prophet in a long chain stretching back to Adam, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. After that first revelation in the cave, something unexpected happened. Silence. For a stretch of time, accounts differ on exactly how long, though many describe it lasting several months, no further revelation came. Muhammad, who had just been told he was God's messenger, was left waiting, unsure, wondering if it would ever happen again. Some accounts describe him in genuine anguish during this gap, longing for the experience to return. Have you ever waited for something important, an answer, a result, a letter, and felt the silence itself was almost harder to bear than bad news would have been? Then the revelations resumed, and this time they carried instruction along with comfort. Muhammad was to begin warning people, gently and privately, starting with those closest to him. The first person he told, of course, was Khadijah, who had already believed him from that very first night. The next was a 10-year-old boy living in his household, his young cousin Ali, the son of his uncle Abu Talib, whom Muhammad had taken in years earlier to ease his uncle's financial burden. One day, young Ali noticed Muhammad and Khadijah praying together in a way he had never seen before, bowing and touching their foreheads to the ground. Curious, he asked what they were doing. Muhammad explained and invited him to join. Ali wanted to ask his father's permission first, but after thinking it over, he reasoned to himself, Allah created me. He did not need to ask my father's permission to do that. Why would I need my father's permission to worship him? And with that, Ali accepted, becoming the first child to embrace the new faith. Around this same time, Muhammad's close friend, a respected and successful merchant named Abu Bakr, returned to Mecca from a business trip and was told, half as a warning, half as gossip, that his old friend Muhammad was now claiming to be a prophet. Rather than reacting with suspicion, Abu Bakr went straight to Muhammad's home and asked him directly whether it was true. Muhammad told him everything and invited him to believe. Abu Bakr, who had known Muhammad for years, who had never once caught him in a lie, who trusted his character completely, accepted immediately, without a single moment of hesitation. Muhammad would later say of him, "Everyone I invited to the faith showed some hesitation, except Abu Bakr. He believed without any doubt at all." Abu Bakr would remain at Muhammad's side for the rest of his life, through every hardship that followed, and is remembered across the Muslim world to this day as one of the most devoted companions in this entire story. Word of Abu Bakr's belief quietly spread among his own circle of trusted friends, and one by one, several of the men who would become some of the most important figures in early Islamic history accepted the faith through his efforts. Faith was not spreading only among the powerful, though. It was also reaching some of the most vulnerable people in Meccan society, including the enslaved. One man, an Abyssinian slave named Bilal ibn Rabah, owned by a harsh Meccan named Umayyah ibn Khalaf, accepted the new faith early on. When his owner discovered this, he tried to force Bilal to renounce it through brutal punishment, having him dragged into the open desert at the hottest part of the day, laid flat on the burning sand, with a massive rock placed on his chest to crush the breath out of him, demanding he curse Muhammad and return to worshipping the old idols. Bilal refused. Through the pain, with barely enough breath to speak, he repeated a single word, over and over, Ahad, Ahad, one, meaning there is only one God, the very belief he was being tortured for refusing to abandon. Abu Bakr, hearing of Bilal's suffering, went to Umayyah and purchased Bilal's freedom on the spot, paying whatever price was asked, simply to end the torture. Bilal would go on to become one of the most beloved companions in early Islam, eventually given the honor of calling people to prayer with his own voice, a voice that had once been used only to cry out in pain under the desert sun. For roughly 3 years, faith spread this way, quietly, person to person, gathering in private at a house belonging to a young early believer named Al-Arqam, which became known as Dar al-Arqam, the House of Arqam. The believers were still few, but that quiet was about to end. A new revelation came, and this one could not be kept private any longer. Muhammad was commanded to proclaim his message openly to all of Mecca, regardless of the cost. He climbed to the top of a small hill near the Kaaba called Mount Safa and called out to the people of the city below, the way someone might call out in an emergency to gather everyone's attention. Curious, the leading men of Mecca, including members of his own extended family, gathered to hear what he had to say. "If I told you there was an army on the other side of this mountain about to attack you," he asked them, "would you believe me?" "Yes," they answered, "we have never known you to lie." "Then I am warning you now," he said, "of a punishment far greater than any army, unless you turn away from worshipping these idols and worship God alone." The reaction was not what many of them might have once predicted, given how deeply they had trusted him for decades. One voice in the crowd, Muhammad's own uncle, Abu Lahab, broke the silence with open contempt. "May your hands perish," he shouted. "Is this why you gathered us?" He stormed off in disgust, and shortly afterward a verse of the Quran would be revealed condemning his cruelty toward his own nephew by name, a sharp reminder that even family ties offered no guaranteed protection in the face of this new dividing message. Think about what it must have felt like to stand on that hill, the most trusted man in the city about to risk every bit of that trust on a single message, and watch some of the people who had relied on him for years turn cold in an instant. Have you ever told the truth about something important, only to watch people you respected turn away from you because of it? From this point forward, the persecution intensified sharply. The wealthy, powerful men of the Quraysh, among them a particularly hostile figure named Abu Jahl, saw Muhammad's message as a direct threat to everything that gave Mecca its power and identity. The idols that drew pilgrims and trade, the tribal hierarchy that gave the wealthy their status, the old ways that had always been the old ways. They mocked Muhammad in the streets, threw filth on him as he walked, and pelted him with stones. But the worst of the violence fell, as it often does, on those with the least power to defend themselves, the poor, the enslaved, and those without strong tribal protection. An elderly couple named Yasir and Sumaya, along with their son Ammar, were among the early believers who suffered severely at the hands of Abu Jahl and others, tortured in the open desert heat for refusing to abandon their faith. Sumaya bint Kabat would not survive the abuse, becoming remembered as the very first martyr of this new community, a woman whose only crime had been believing in one God. Muhammad himself was protected from the very worst physical violence, largely because of one crucial fact. His uncle Abu Talib, though he never personally accepted the new faith, refused to abandon his nephew to the mob, standing firmly between Muhammad and those who might have killed him outright. In Meccan tribal society, this kind of family protection mattered enormously. Without it, Muhammad's fate might have been sealed in those very first years. The Quraysh eventually attempted to pressure Abu Talib into withdrawing his protection by offering and then threatening his entire clan, the Banu Hashim, with a complete social and economic boycott. No trading with them, no marrying into their families, no buying from or selling to them at all. Abu Talib refused to give in, even as the boycott squeezed his clan into real hardship. The pressure was relentless, and it was only going to grow heavier. For a small group of the believers, Mecca had simply become too dangerous to remain in any longer. In the year 615 CE, with persecution intensifying and no end in sight, Muhammad made a decision that prioritized his followers' safety over keeping the small community together in one place. He instructed a group of believers, including his own cousin Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, the brother of Ali, to leave Mecca entirely and seek refuge across the Red Sea in the Christian kingdom of Abyssinia in what is today Ethiopia. Why Abyssinia? Because its ruler, known by the royal title Negus, was known throughout the region as a deeply just king, and Muhammad trusted that a genuinely fair Christian ruler would treat this small group of refugees who shared belief in one God and respect for earlier prophets with decency. He was right, but the Quraysh were not willing to simply let the matter rest. Furious that some of the believers had escaped their reach entirely, Meccan leaders sent a delegation across the sea to the Negus' court, bearing expensive gifts, asking him to hand the refugees back over to face punishment in Mecca. The Negus, before agreeing to anything, summoned the Muslim refugees to his court and asked them directly to explain their faith. Ja'far ibn Abi Talib stood and spoke on behalf of the group, describing how they had once worshipped idols, mistreated the weak, and lived without moral guidance, until a messenger arose among them, calling them to worship one God, to honor their parents, to protect the vulnerable, and to abandon the old cruelties. He then recited, in front of the entire royal court, verses from the Quran describing the birth of Jesus and his mother Mary with deep reverence. The Negus, moved by what he heard, verses honoring a figure central to his own faith, wept openly and declared that this message and the message of Jesus came, in his words, from the same lamp. He refused to hand the refugees over, sent the Meccan delegation home empty-handed, and granted the small community safety in his kingdom. This event marked the very first hijrah, meaning migration, in Islamic history, years before the far more famous migration we will reach soon, the one that would eventually mark year 1 of the entire Islamic calendar. Back in Mecca, the persecution did not ease. If anything, watching their own efforts fail across the sea only deepened the resentment of Muhammad's opponents, and the hardest years of his life, years that would test him more deeply than anything that had come before, were still ahead. By the year 619 CE, Muhammad had been delivering his message for nearly a decade. The boycott against his clan had finally been lifted after years of hardship. The small community of believers had grown despite relentless opposition, and yet 2 losses were about to strike Muhammad within the same year, losses so heavy that this period in his life would forever be remembered by a single name: Am al-Huzn, the year of sorrow. The first loss was his uncle Abu Talib. For nearly 40 years, Abu Talib had stood between Muhammad and danger, taking in an orphaned 8-year-old out of pure family loyalty, sheltering him through years of boycott and threats, refusing every demand from the Quraysh to abandon his nephew, even though Abu Talib himself never formally accepted Muhammad's message as his own faith. As Abu Talib lay dying, Muhammad sat beside him and gently asked him once more to declare belief in one God, a final wish offered out of love rather than pressure. According to the accounts passed down, Abu Talib's answer remained uncertain, leaving Muhammad to grieve not only the loss of his protector, but the unresolved hope for his uncle's soul. With Abu Talib gone, Muhammad lost more than family. He lost the protection that had kept the worst violence of Mecca at bay for nearly a decade. The Quraysh, sensing the shield was finally down, grew bolder and crueler almost immediately. And then came the second loss, the one that struck even deeper. Khadijah, his wife of 25 years, the first person to ever believe him, the one who wrapped him in a cloak on the night he came running down the mountain in terror, the one whose wealth and standing had helped protect the earliest believers, the one who had stood beside him through every hardship without a single moment of doubt, fell ill and died only weeks or months after Abu Talib. Muhammad was now around 50 years old. He had lost his father before birth, his mother at 6, his grandfather at 8, his protector uncle, and now the wife who had been his closest companion and ally for half his life. Have you ever lost someone you depended on and felt like the ground beneath your feet had simply disappeared? Muhammad himself would later say that this year brought him the deepest grief he had ever known, heavier, by his own account, than any single hardship that had come before it. Even decades later, long after his life had changed in ways no one in Mecca could have predicted, Muhammad continued to speak of Khadijah with deep tenderness and made sure her family and friends were always treated with honor for her sake. She remained, in his own words, irreplaceable. It would have been understandable for any person, after a year like this, to feel that God had abandoned them entirely, alone, unprotected, grieving 2 people who had given him everything. And yet what happened next was the opposite of abandonment. It was, according to Islamic tradition, one of the most extraordinary nights of his entire life. One night, not long after the grief of that terrible year, Muhammad lay resting near the Kaaba when the angel Gabriel appeared to him once more, this time not to deliver a verse, but to take him somewhere. According to Islamic tradition, Muhammad was brought a creature called Al-Buraq, often described as swift beyond anything on earth, and in a single night he traveled from Mecca all the way to Jerusalem, a journey that would normally take weeks by camel. This part of the journey is called the Isra, the night journey. In Jerusalem, at the site later honored as Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, tradition holds that Muhammad led the spirits of all the earlier prophets, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and others, in prayer, as though to show that this new message stood in unity with everything that had come before it, rather than apart from it. From Jerusalem, the journey continued upward, the Miraj, the Ascension, through what tradition describes as 7 heavens, where Muhammad is said to have met several of the earlier prophets individually: Adam, John the Baptist, Jesus, Joseph, Moses, Abraham, each greeting him as a fellow messenger of the one God. At the highest point of the journey, Muhammad received the instruction that would become one of the central pillars of his entire faith, the command for believers to pray 5 times daily. Let's be honest about something here. This is a matter of religious belief, not something that can be measured or proven the way we measure ordinary historical events. And Muslims themselves hold it as exactly that, a sacred matter of faith, central to how they understand their prophet's unique closeness to God. We share it here the way it has been passed down for 14 centuries, because you cannot understand this story or what it means to over 1 billion people today without it. When Muhammad returned to Mecca and described what had happened, the reaction split his city sharply in 2. His enemies mocked him openly, certain that no one could believe such a claim, and pointed to it as final proof he had lost his senses entirely. Many who had been wavering on the edge of belief walked away. But one man, hearing the story second-hand from someone hoping to shake his faith, did not hesitate for even a moment. "If Muhammad himself says this happened," Abu Bakr answered, "then it is true." When pressed further with details meant to sound impossible, he simply added, "I believe him in stranger things than this. I believe that revelation comes to him directly from God. That alone is harder to believe than a single night's journey." It was this very moment that earned Abu Bakr a title that has stayed attached to his name throughout Islamic history ever since: As-Siddiq, the one who never hesitates to affirm the truth. Mecca's reaction told Muhammad something important, though it must have been painful to learn. Even an experience this profound would not soften the hearts of those determined to reject him. If his message was ever going to take root and grow into something lasting, it might not happen in Mecca at all. And, unknown to him yet, the answer to where it could take root was already beginning to form, 300 kilometers to the north, in a city called Yathrib, where a small group of strangers had started listening to his message with open hearts. Every year, pilgrims and traders from across Arabia came to Mecca during the pilgrimage season, and Muhammad had long made a habit of approaching visiting tribes to share his message, even as his own city grew more hostile toward him. In 620 CE, he met a small group of men from Yathrib, a city to the north with a very different social structure than Mecca's. Split among several Arab tribes and Jewish communities, often locked in tension with one another, and lacking any single dominant power the way the Quraysh dominated Mecca. These men listened to Muhammad's message, and after returning home and sharing it, came back the following year with more believers from their city, eager to commit to something deeper. This commitment came to be known as the Pledge of Aqaba, sworn at a place by that name just outside Mecca, first a smaller pledge of faith and conduct, then, a year later, a much larger and more consequential one. Representatives from Yathrib, numbering around 75, pledged not only their belief, but their protection. They invited Muhammad and his persecuted followers to come live among them, and swore to defend them as they would defend their own families. For Muhammad and the small, exhausted community of believers in Mecca, beaten, boycotted, mocked, and grieving, this was the opening they had been waiting years for, a place willing to receive them, not with suspicion, but with open arms. Quietly, over the following months, believers began slipping out of Mecca in small groups, making their way north toward Yathrib, a city that would soon be renamed Madinat an-Nabi, the city of the Prophet, Medina as we know it today. The Quraysh, realizing what was happening, grew alarmed. If Muhammad reached a city full of new allies willing to protect him, he would be entirely beyond their reach, and his message, instead of fading under pressure the way they had hoped, would have a permanent home to grow from. They could not allow that. According to the traditional accounts, the leaders of Mecca's most powerful clans devised a plan calculated to escape all consequence. Rather than have a single clan responsible for killing Muhammad, which would have triggered an unbreakable cycle of tribal revenge, they agreed that one young, able-bodied man from every major clan would strike together, each one driving a blade into him at the same instant, spreading the blood guilt so widely across so many families that no single clan could ever be made to answer for it alone. Imagine that for a moment, an entire city's leadership agreeing, deliberately and in advance, to kill one man together, specifically so that no one could ever be properly held responsible. But Muhammad had been warned. According to tradition, Gabriel informed him of the plot in advance, and he prepared a plan of his own. It is the dead of night. Outside Muhammad's house, a group of armed men crouch in the shadows, blades ready, waiting only for first light to burst in and strike all at once. Inside, Muhammad asks his young cousin Ali to lie down in his bed, wrapped in his own green cloak, a decoy so that anyone glancing through the doorway in the dark would believe Muhammad himself was still sleeping there. Then, quietly, Muhammad slips out through the back of the house unseen and disappears into the night. He made his way to the home of his closest friend, Abu Bakr, who had already prepared 2 camels and supplies in secret, expecting this moment might come. Rather than fleeing immediately north toward Medina, the most obvious direction, and the one their pursuers would search first, the 2 men went the opposite way, south, to a cave on Mount Thawr, where they hid for 3 full days. You are pressed into the dark of a narrow cave, hardly able to move, while outside you can hear the voices and footsteps of armed search parties combing the rocks just beyond the entrance, close enough to touch. Abu Bakr, terrified for Muhammad's life rather than his own, whispers his fear. Muhammad answers him calmly, "Do not grieve. God is with us." According to tradition, in that very moment, a spider had spun a web across the cave's entrance, and a dove had nested just beside it. Small, ordinary details that, to the search party glancing in, made the cave look as though no one could possibly have entered it recently at all. The searchers turned away. When it was finally safe, Muhammad and Abu Bakr set out on the long desert journey north toward Medina, not in a straight line, but along a winding, unexpected route, to avoid capture. At one point during the journey, a skilled tracker named Suraka ibn Malik, lured by the bounty offered for Muhammad's capture, nearly caught up with them. According to the account, just as he closed the distance, his horse stumbled and threw him to the ground, and rather than try again, Suraka, struck by something he couldn't fully explain, chose instead to let them go, and even warned others he passed not to pursue them either. This journey, known as the Hijra, meaning migration, is so significant in Islamic history that it became the starting point of the entire Islamic calendar. Year 1 in the Islamic calendar is not Muhammad's birth, and not the first revelation in the cave. It is this journey, the moment the small community found a home, willing to protect it, and finally had the safety to grow. After days of difficult travel through open desert, Muhammad and his companions finally arrived at the outskirts of Medina. According to tradition, the people of the city, who had been anxiously waiting and watching the horizon for days, came out to meet him with overwhelming joy, children and adults alike lining the road, some singing songs of welcome that are still remembered and sung in many parts of the Muslim world today. Mecca had rejected him. Mecca had mocked him, starved his followers, and plotted his death. But here, in this new city, a man with no home of his own had just been welcomed by strangers as though he belonged to them entirely. He was about 53 years old. He had lost nearly everyone closest to him in Mecca, and yet, standing in this unfamiliar city, surrounded by people who had pledged their protection before ever truly knowing him, he was, for the first time in over a decade, finally safe. What he would build here, over the next 10 years, would change not just his own life, but the shape of the entire Arabian Peninsula, and ultimately the world. Arriving safely in Medina was only the beginning of an enormous task. Muhammad now had to do something that had never quite been attempted in Arabia before: build a single, functioning community out of people who, only months earlier, had no reason to trust one another at all. The believers who had migrated from Mecca were called the Muhajirun, the migrants, men and women who had left behind their homes, their businesses, sometimes even family members who refused to come, arriving in Medina with little more than the clothes they wore. The believers already living in Medina, who had pledged to protect and support them, were called the Ansar, the helpers. Think about what was being asked of the Ansar. Imagine a city where every family suddenly opened its doors, its farmland, even its own income, to share with strangers who had arrived with nothing. According to the accounts passed down from this time, many of the Ansar offered to literally split their property and orchards in half with the new arrivals, refusing to let pride or scarcity get in the way of the bond Muhammad asked them to form. Muhammad formally paired individual Muhajirun with individual Ansar as adopted brothers, creating bonds of loyalty as strong as blood family, in a city that had never known these two groups as anything but separate people only weeks before. But Medina held more than just these two groups. The city was also home to several established Jewish tribes, among them the Banu Kainuka, the Banu Nadir, and the Banu Qurayza, who had lived in the region for generations, as well as Arab tribes who had not yet accepted Muhammad's message at all. If Medina was going to function as one city rather than fracture into competing factions, all of these groups needed a shared framework to live by. Muhammad addressed this by drawing up what is often called the Constitution of Medina, a written agreement, remarkably advanced for its time, that bound the different tribes and faith communities of the city together under a shared set of obligations. It guaranteed religious freedom for the Jewish tribes to practice their own faith without interference. It established that all the groups named in the document would unite for the common defense of the city if any of them were attacked from outside. And it set out a basic system of justice, with disputes to be referred ultimately to Muhammad himself as the arbitrator the city had agreed upon. Many historians regard the Constitution of Medina as one of the earliest written constitutions in human history, a formal document defining the rights and responsibilities of a diverse, multi-faith city, agreed to by every group living within it. This was the beginning of what would come to be called the Ummah, a word that doesn't simply mean religion, the way we might think of it, but a whole community, bound together by shared commitment rather than by tribe or bloodline alone, something genuinely new in a region where identity had always been built around family lineage first. Building a community out of strangers, refugees, and former rivals is never simple, and Medina's peace would not remain untested for long. Mecca had not forgotten Muhammad, and from this point forward, the story of his life becomes inseparable from the story of a young, vulnerable community learning to defend its very right to exist. For more than a decade in Mecca, Muhammad had endured mockery, boycotts, and violence without ever raising a hand in response. He had been instructed, through revelation, to remain patient under persecution. But once the community was settled in Medina, facing not just insults now, but the real possibility of being hunted down and destroyed entirely, a new revelation permitted the believers, for the first time, to take up arms in their own defense. It's worth pausing on that order of events. Self-defense was permitted only after years of restraint, and only once the threat to the community's survival had become undeniable. This is an important detail to hold on to as we move through the chapters ahead. In March of 624 CE, word reached Muhammad that a large and valuable Meccan trading caravan, led by a powerful merchant named Abu Sufyan, was returning from Syria, the same trade that had funded Mecca's hostility toward the believers for years. Muhammad set out from Medina with a small group, somewhere around 300 men, intending to intercept the caravan, which traveled with relatively light protection. But Abu Sufyan learned of the plan in time, rerouted the caravan to safety, and sent an urgent message back to Mecca. The Quraysh, furious that Muhammad had dared move against their trade at all, assembled an army of roughly 900 to 1,000 men, armed, mounted, and provisioned far better than anything Muhammad's small band could match, and marched out to crush the threat once and for all. Muhammad and his companions suddenly found themselves facing not a lightly guarded caravan, but a full Meccan army, nearly 3 times their size, at a well-watered location called Badr. You are standing in the heat near a well called Badr, with a few hundred companions around you. some of them barely more than boys, most without proper armor, sharing weapons between them because there simply aren't enough to go around. Across the open ground, an army 3 times your number is forming its lines, confident, well supplied, certain of an easy victory. Your heart is pounding. You glance at the man beside you, exhausted and afraid, and you wonder honestly whether you will see the sun set today. That night before the battle, accounts describe Muhammad spending much of it in prayer, asking God for support, fully aware of how badly outnumbered his small community was. The next morning, the 2 sides met. Despite the imbalance in numbers, the Muslims fought with discipline, secured the high ground near the wells, and held their formation under pressure. Several notable Meccan leaders, including the fierce and outspoken Abu Jahl, one of Muhammad's harshest persecutors back in Mecca, were killed in the fighting. Within hours, the Meccan army broke and fled the field entirely. It was an extraordinary, almost unbelievable victory, the kind that, in the years that followed, the small Muslim community would look back on as a defining moment of their survival. The Quran itself reflects on the battle, describing the victory as coming through God's support of a small, faithful group against overwhelming odds. Even in this first and most desperate battle, Muhammad gave clear instructions about how prisoners were to be treated, with food, decent shelter, and dignity, not cruelty. Several of the Meccan prisoners taken at Badr later spoke of being treated better by their captors than they had expected, some even given the captors' own food, while the captors themselves went without. Badr was a turning point, proof to the small community in Medina that they could survive, and a humiliating shock to Mecca, which had expected this to be the final, decisive end of the matter. It was not the end. It was in many ways only the beginning of a much longer conflict still ahead. Loss does not always come from external defeat. Sometimes it comes from mistakes made within. The Battle of Uhud, fought roughly a year after Badr, would teach the young Muslim community one of the hardest lessons of discipline they would ever learn, and it would come at a painful cost. Stung by the humiliation of Badr, Mecca spent the following year rebuilding a far larger force, determined to erase the defeat. In March of 625 CE, an army of roughly 3,000 Meccan soldiers, including, notably, Abu Sufyan's wife Hind bint Utbah, who had lost close family members at Badr and was determined to see them avenged, marched toward Medina itself. Muhammad led around 700 men out to meet them near a mountain called Uhud, just outside Medina. Before the battle began, he made a critical tactical decision. He positioned a group of skilled archers on a small hill overlooking the battlefield, with explicit, unmistakable instructions. Hold this position no matter what happens, whether we appear to be winning or losing, until I personally give the order to move. The battle began, and for a stretch of time it went remarkably well for the Muslims. The Meccan lines broke under the pressure of the advance, and many of their soldiers began fleeing the field, abandoning supplies and equipment behind them. You are one of the archers stationed on the hill, watching the battle unfold below. The enemy is retreating. Soldiers around you are already celebrating, rushing down toward the abandoned camp to gather what's been left behind. Victory feels close enough to touch. Do you hold your position exactly as ordered, or do you join the others, certain the battle is already won? Most of the archers, believing the fight was effectively over, left their post on the hill to join in collecting the spoils, against the direct order they had been given. It was a fatal mistake. A skilled Meccan cavalry commander named Khalid ibn al-Walid, who had not yet become a Muslim himself at this point in the story, though he would later become one of the most important commanders in Islamic history, spotted the now undefended hill, swung his cavalry around behind the Muslim lines, and struck from the rear. The momentum of the battle reversed almost instantly. In the chaos, word spread, falsely, that Muhammad himself had been killed, and panic briefly scattered the Muslim ranks even further. In truth, Muhammad had been struck and wounded, knocked to the ground, his lip cut and a tooth broken, but he was very much alive. A small group of his closest companions fought desperately around him to protect him from being overwhelmed, several of them giving their lives in that effort. Among those lost that day was Muhammad's own uncle, Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib, a man known for his courage and strength, killed in the fighting, his body afterward treated with deliberate cruelty by some on the Meccan side in revenge for losses at Badr. It was a painful, brutal loss, and Muhammad mourned him deeply. By the end of the day, the Muslims had suffered serious losses, far heavier than at Badr, though the Meccan army, exhausted itself, chose not to press the advantage further and withdrew rather than pursuing a final, total victory. In the aftermath, rather than placing blame outward, the Quran's reflection on the battle turned attention inward. Toward the moment discipline had broken down, when an order was abandoned, the instant victory seemed assured. It became a lesson the early Muslim community would carry with it for the rest of its history, that obedience and patience matter most not when things are going badly, but in the very moment they appear to be going well. Years later, the very same Khalid ibn al-Walid, who delivered this painful defeat at Uhud, would accept Islam himself and go on to become one of its most celebrated military leaders. A reminder that, throughout this story, even fierce opponents were never written off as permanent enemies. Uhud had been a wound, both physically and emotionally. But Medina's survival was still very much in question, and an even larger threat to the young community's existence was still to come. By 627 CE, Mecca had grown desperate to finish what 2 battles had failed to accomplish. This time, the Quraysh did not march alone. They assembled a sweeping coalition of allied tribes from across the region, so large that the army marching toward Medina numbered somewhere around 10,000 soldiers, an overwhelming force compared to anything the small Muslim community had ever faced. When word reached Medina of the size of the approaching army, panic was understandable. How could a city of a few thousand defenders possibly survive an army that size in open battle? Muhammad called his companions together to plan, and a Persian convert to Islam named Salman al-Farsi offered an idea unfamiliar to Arabian warfare at the time, but well known in his homeland: dig a deep, wide trench around the exposed sides of Medina, the sides not already protected by natural terrain, making it nearly impossible for cavalry, the core strength of the attacking force, to charge directly into the city. Muhammad approved the plan immediately, and the entire community threw itself into the labor, believers digging side by side for days in the cold, including Muhammad himself, who worked alongside everyone else, moving earth and stone rather than simply directing from a distance. Accounts from this time describe genuine hunger among the workers, food running short as the siege dragged on, and Muhammad himself tying a stone against his stomach, a customary way of easing the physical sensation of extreme hunger, working through it rather than resting while others continued laboring. When the massive coalition army finally arrived and found the trench blocking their cavalry charge, they were stunned and unprepared for siege warfare of this kind. Unable to cross effectively, the army settled into a long, tense standoff outside the trench, exchanging arrows and occasional skirmishes, but unable to break through. You are standing watch along the edge of the trench at night, cold wind cutting through your cloak, an enemy force of thousands camped just beyond the dark, close enough that you can sometimes hear their voices carried on the wind. Weeks have passed this way. Food is scarce. No one knows how much longer the siege will last, or whether the trench will hold if the enemy finds a way across. The siege dragged on for nearly a month, and as the weeks wore on, the coalition itself began fracturing from within. Disagreements between allied tribes, harsh weather, and a sudden, fierce windstorm that tore through the besieging camp, destroying tents and scattering supplies. Discouraged, exhausted, and divided, the coalition army eventually abandoned the siege entirely and withdrew without ever breaking into the city. The Battle of the Trench, as it came to be known, proved to be the last major attempt by Mecca to destroy the Muslim community by force. Medina had held, and from this point forward, the balance of power across the region would begin shifting, slowly but unmistakably, toward Muhammad and his growing community. By 628 CE, 6 years had passed since the Hijrah. Muhammad had not set foot in Mecca, the city of his birth, in all that time, the city that held the Kaaba, the place his entire community still longed to visit in peace. That year, Muhammad announced his intention to lead a large group. Some accounts describe around 1,400 believers, not for battle, but for pilgrimage, dressed in the simple pilgrim garments that signaled peaceful intent, carrying no weapons of war beyond what was customary for travelers' protection. Word reached Mecca that Muhammad was approaching, unarmed for battle, intending only to perform the pilgrimage rites at the Kaaba his own grandfather had once carried him to as a newborn. The Quraysh, still wary and uncertain how to respond, moved to block his entry, gathering forces at a place called Hudaybiyah, just outside the city's boundary. Rather than force a confrontation, Muhammad halted his entire group at Hudaybiyah and opened negotiations. It would have been easy, with over 1,000 followers behind him, to push the issue toward conflict. Instead, he chose patience and diplomacy, sending representatives, including Uthman ibn Affan, to negotiate directly with the Meccan leadership. The negotiations stretched on tensely for days, and at one point, a false rumor spread through the camp that Uthman had been killed inside Mecca. Furious and afraid, the assembled believers gathered around Muhammad and pledged right there under a tree that they would fight to the death if necessary, rather than abandon him, a moment remembered as the pledge of the tree, and one the Quran later refers to with deep approval. Uthman, it turned out, was safe, and negotiations eventually produced a treaty, though one whose terms initially struck many of Muhammad's own followers as deeply unfair. The treaty stated that the Muslims would not be permitted to enter Mecca that year at all, and would have to return the following year instead to complete the pilgrimage. It also included a clause requiring that any Meccan who fled to join the Muslims without their family's permission would be returned to Mecca, though, notably, the reverse was not required for Muslims fleeing toward Mecca. Imagine traveling all that distance, bringing your entire community along, ready to finally visit the holiest site in your faith, and then being told, after everything, that you'd have to turn back without ever reaching it. Many of Muhammad's own companions, including the otherwise unshakable Umar ibn al-Khattab, were furious and openly questioned why Muhammad would accept terms that seemed so one-sided against them. Muhammad accepted the treaty anyway, trusting that the long-term peace it secured mattered more than the short-term sting of its terms. And history would prove him right, in a way few could have predicted at the time. The truce established by the Treaty of Hudaybiyah created the first real period of calm between Mecca and Medina in years. And in that calm, with travel and communication between the two cities finally possible without fear of violence, more people converted to Islam in the 2 years following the treaty than in all the previous years of open conflict combined. The treaty would not last the full 10 years its terms promised, but by the time it broke down, the balance of power between Mecca and Medina had shifted so completely that what came next would unfold not as a war, but as something far closer to a homecoming.